talk a little. I'm going to have is Democrats do this kind of thing, and whether it continues or whether it doesn't continue, whatever the politics are, as I indicated last week, the real issue is what do you do about management? Because clearly the marketplace is moving, and issues with regard to the Affordable Care Act, with regard to how medicine changes from volume to value, how we deal with trying to deal with a team approach to dealing with medicine versus individual. Doctor in a silo different from hospital, different in a silo different from pharmacy, are things that are all changing, and the marketplace is changing irregardless of what goes on politically with the Affordable Care Act. What I'm interested in is that over the last week, and PhRMA had nothing to do with this, but over the last week, several entities have been identifying things that they want to see changed with regard to management. So it doesn't have to deal with issues with regard to the politics of whether the Affordable Care Act lives or dies, but rather with regard to the regulatory issues that goes on with regard to CMS and the National Institute of Health, et cetera, and how they deal with the Affordable Care Act. And so many are coming up with now a new criteria that they want to do, and interestingly, it's coming out of the industry itself rather than when the Affordable Care Act was being debated. It's interesting that there wasn't a huge representation coming out of physician groups, nursing groups, pharmacy groups, other than like or don't like, but nothing that really took on the major stage as it did with politics. However, many of these groups now are saying, within the confines of the Affordable Care Act, there are rules and things that need to change so that we can make it work. So what's interesting is they're coming up with new rules that they want with regard to how many days that you can be in a nursing facility versus being eligible for coverage. And by the way, many of these are focused on the eligibility and when you can start counting, when you can include them in your severity indices, etc. So there is a move here that's going on, and it's interesting to see what they're doing with regard to different measures and how they want to include it. They want to take away a lot of the restrictions that are in the Affordable Care Act to when people can start to be counted, whether they're seeing a physician or not seeing a physician, whether they're including pharmacy data so that you know that they're getting prescriptions for a given disease, even if they haven't seen a doctor for it recently, and things like that. So that's I think is an interesting move, and it's interesting in that the industry itself sees that there are changes to do, irregardless of what happens politically. The second issue I think that's of interest is that all of the movement that's been going on about cost with regard to the cost of drugs, we haven't talked as much about the issue that the entire pharmaceutical industry is international. It's not of argument. The argument that we see is that if you look at the marketplace, the argument that has been given is that prices should be high within the continental United States because that's where the money is required in order to deal with issues for money that is necessary for research and development. However, irregardless of whether people are getting money and whether the drugs are costly, drugs are now being developed literally almost everywhere. There's marketplaces in Brazil and South Africa and China and India and literally all over the world, especially as well in Europe. And so many of the companies even that are the primary manufacturers of drugs are looking at the world and they're saying that, well, we have drugs, but perhaps our innovation engine within our company isn't as great. And so now they've become more research and development arms, which is fine. But in order to find the more interesting drugs, in order to find products that in fact are really curative kind of issues, they're moving to companies that are owned or they're research-based organizations that are going on in Europe, in other parts of the world, and they're putting money behind the development of products within these companies, and then either buying a stake in the company or even buying the company outright in order to beef up their overall research engine. So we need to be aware of and pay attention to that this is an international market. I've mentioned before that even today, and it's been going on for years, the largest source of raw materials of branded products is India. The largest resource of raw materials for generic products is Israel. So we're already in an international market that's supplying raw materials, and now we have to address the fact that even in the biotechnology, these newer products that are large proteins or antibodies or otherwise in order to try and attack diseases that have not been attacked before, or products that improve our overall care. These are international products, and so the issue and the argument that, well, you can't, you have to have higher prices in the United States has to be argued within the context that many of these new products are coming from other countries and that they're being brought in, as well as, by the way, the companies that do research are doing research not just in the United States, but they're doing research in Asia, they're doing research in Europe, in other places, in order to build a big enough group of patients that they can review and they can identify for treatment for these given conditions, many of which don't have a huge number of patients in the first place, so it's necessary in order to try and bring in a larger population. The other thing I wanted to talk about is data. We live in a world today where everybody is just making comments without any reference to information, whether it's true or not. We do live in a political world where there's fact checkers and people that are looking to see whether somebody has said something. But we live in the world, or I live in the world of healthcare, and we are scientists and mathematicians and data analysts, and we have to address this. And so I think it's important that when we look at data, we address the fact that whoever you are, you don't have to be a mathematician, you don't have to be a scientist or an analyst in order to deal with it, but there's some fundamental questions that you need to look at. One is, what are the biases that are coming out of this? Because you can easily bias a scientific study by driving towards a solution that you want. Now, many people have argued, I've certainly argued, and so have many others, that there's a big difference between science and everything else, or even science and religion, in that religion starts with an answer and moves towards methods to try and prove it. Science doesn't come up with a solution, it comes up with methods, and whatever the solution is that has been verified is the important one. We need to know, whenever you hear information or otherwise, what's the bias, and effectively then review things based on that bias to ensure the fact that the right questions have been asked. A fundamental issue in science is that the most important thing in science is not the solution, it's the question, because you can drive the answer based on the question. So we certainly want to know what is the question and what the bias is. The second issue that you want to know is that many people are taking associations and turning them into a that this is in fact the reality, and that this is the cause. It's causative and not just associative. It's easy to come up with associations. It's harder to address when something you don't know. It just is an association. It wasn't controlled for. You don't know. It just looks like that people with black hair always seem to have the same behavior. But that's not an argument. That's only an identification of an association. There has to be some controls in order to identify that it was really causative. And finally is the issue that people say things, or one person says something, or in science one person says something, and then everybody agrees to it, and somehow there's been no large number issue in order to address it. The most, perhaps biggest cause celeb over the last decade was the individual who put through a paper in Nature that identified that vaccines caused autism. He was later shown to have fudged the data, that he really didn't have any causative information. It was the association. People took hold of it and started to argue about it. He was later found out. His medical degree was pulled. The paper was pulled. Everything was identified to show that it was false, but people still believe it. We really need to know whether there are large bodies of information that have been done. A rule of thumb used to be that, well, if you had at least a population that you studied of at least somewhere in the range of 250, you were pretty good. But it really depends on the statistical tests that are done. But at the end of the day, if you're not coming up with associations that deal with literally hundreds of people, then you're just looking at, in general, associations that don't have a good measure of proof, and it's purely just an association, and it may be something that's suggestive, but it isn't necessarily causative. I truly appreciate you taking time to talk to me. I look forward to talking to you again. Please feel free to go to the PhRMA website, and also go to www.PhRMAconsultants.com/rxinfox.html for our daily news feed, so that you can see what's going on. It's entirely free and entirely there, so that you can find out what the news is and what's going on, and we'll continue to keep you appraised of what goes on. Have an outstanding rest of the week.